Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like, and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And as you may have noticed, I have a new background. This is my new place that I am living in, and for the foreseeable future, this is where I'm going to be recording my YouTube videos, and there should be more content on the way in addition to this new video I'm making, which is another episode, or rather a new episode as well, of quick album reviews. It's been a while since I've done one of these quick section series that I do, but it is that time, and there's just a lot that I haven't gotten to talk about that I want to. As always with my quick album review series, I will be talking about different albums in shorter succession and just giving my quick thoughts on each of them. And today I have 8 different albums on the docket, so let's not waste any more time and get started with the first album that I will be discussing. So first up is Metallica's album 72 Seasons. Now keep in mind that the albums I'm going to be talking about here have been all over the place in terms of release dates. Hopefully I'll start talking about more consistent release date times when I get to these other quick album reviews that I do in the future. But as it usually is with these series, it's almost always just all over the place. So bear with me as I go pretty much everywhere in terms of when the release dates were. But nevertheless, Metallica 72 Seasons. Now this has been the year that I have gotten into Metallica big time. I'll be honest, the only album of theirs that I had heard in any way, shape, or form before this year was Master of Puppets. This year, I delved into their whole discography, yes, the good and the bad, and overall, I do think that they have some really, really high highs, like some super high highs, but then they have some incredible lows, which is, of course, a consensus that a lot of people have. But I think modern Metallica is generally fine, the one from the 2010s at least. I like the album Hardwired to Self-Destruct especially, one of their more modern albums, and I like Death Magnetic quite a bit, so I was pretty optimistic about this new album 72 Seasons. And overall, I did have a fun time with this one, but it is sort of a marker of a more mediocre Metallica album to me. It's not a bad one by any means, but I do think it's one where there are a lot of forgettable moments in it, which I wish I didn't have to say. Some of these songs really don't need to be as long as they are. For an example, Sleepwalk My Life Away is a pretty dull song that goes on way too long at nearly 7 minutes, and just doesn't do much in its runtime besides having a pretty repetitive riff that gets rather tiresome pretty quickly. I think If Darkness Had a Sun is an example of this as well, with just a chorus that doesn't really leave me much interested in what is going on. But there are also some really positive high moments on this album. I think the title track, 72 Seasons, is one of the best things that Metallica has made in quite some time, and could end up being one of my favorite Metallica songs. I really like the return to their thrashy roots on this one, and even Screaming Suicide. I know a lot of people weren't a huge fan of this single, but I like the more positive nature of the song and the important message it's giving. Room of Mirrors is also particularly great, with just a really big feeling to it, and once again a return to a more thrash sound that a lot of people have been wanting out of Metallica. And Inamorata is a pretty impressive closer at 11 minutes with a lot of interesting variations going on in its runtime. But like I did say, I do think this album runs a little bit too long, and the themes that it discusses can get just a little bit repetitive for my taste. But still, overall, I do think this is a pretty enjoyable album, and it's one that is easy to have fun with. So I'm going to give this a solid 3 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about the new Jelly Roll album, Whitsitt Chapel. Now, if you don't know who this is, to be honest, I didn't know who this was until their song Son of a Sinner got really big last year on the Billboard Hot 100, and I thought it was a pretty solid song, although not one of my favorites of the Hot 100 last year. I did want to check out this artist. I was really curious about him because he was before this a rapper and was primarily known for hip-hop, but he has transitioned pretty much full-on into country with these past 2 new albums that he's had. He had one last year that was pretty much full-on country, and this one here is pretty much full-on country as well. And I will say for this new album, there is some stuff to like about it. I think a lot of people will like the very neo-traditional feeling it has, and those who are religious will appreciate the religious imagery going on and the religious stories that he tells. I think it is interesting the way that Jelly Roll pairs up the fact that he's a very flawed person with drinking problems and drug problems in the past, and that he's rough around the edges, but that he's tried to fix himself up and get right with God, while at the same time still knowing that he does have that rough part of him that he isn't going to be able to easily let go of. I think that's an interesting point he makes on a song like Halfway to Hell or even The Lost, which I really like the message of The Lost, and it seems very much in line with God's teachings, with the fact that he feels like he identifies more with the people who would be more considered sinners by the modern day people than those who are just a traditional Christian. Unfortunately, probably the biggest problem with this album is that central arc that I was discussing of the idea that he is a drunk and he smokes sometimes but is also a Christian is something that is repeated time and time again on this album, to the point where it just starts becoming rather uninteresting in my opinion. And at a certain point you realize that he has this one trick and he keeps on using it. Now, I understand it's what got him popular on Son of a Sinner, this idea of a very flawed Christian in many ways, but the fact that he's using that as a crutch for this shows that, to me, he needs to expand what his songwriting is, because after a while, it does start getting rather uninteresting on this album. So overall, the album does balance out to being average, and especially the second half of this album becomes rather forgettable to me. 2.5 out of 5 stars for this one for me. Next up is the new album from a rather as well new rock band, alt, called Abeyance. Now, to be honest, the only way I found out about this group was through recommendations on my YouTube, and oftentimes YouTube recommendations come in a pretty interesting way and give me some intriguing things to check out, and I would say that that is once again the case for alt. And to be honest, their album this year for me was sort of what I wish Crown the Empire's album had been, in terms of it being a creative journey with a lot of radio rock tendencies, but still knowing how to take certain risks. One thing I will say is that at 10 tracks and 33 minutes, almost 34, this album goes by fast and stays consistently energetic and interesting, and I appreciate a rock album that doesn't overstay its welcome and knows when it needs to end, and still ends up having some very creative moments in the midst of it. I think the opening of this album is particularly strong with its first 4 tracks. Parasite is a huge burst of energy that really shows you what this band is all about, with some explosive guitar work and a great performance from a vocalist who has a pretty impressive range and might be one of the better new rock vocalists I've heard in a while. And then The Great Depression is even better and talks about exactly what you would expect it to from the title. And the focus on mental health on this album is one that I think generally works. I think it's a good thematic arc for the album to go through, and does help you connect with the singer, and helps the album have a pretty deeply personal touch that I think works. I think there is a certain vulnerability to it that will make a lot of people connect with it for one reason or the other. ADD comes in as probably my favorite song on the album, with a lot of cool variation in it. It does have sort of what you would expect out of a typical radio rock chorus, but I generally like what it has to offer and think it's a lot of fun. And the title track here is great as well. There are some songs on this album that keep it from being a home run for me. For example, I think Back to Earth, even though it is trying to have this sort of interesting, fun dance feel, it doesn't necessarily work for me as much as I would like it to, and it feels a little awkward and out of place on the album in my opinion. And also, The Only Good Thing is a little cliched and has some awkward ways of phrasing its lyrics. It's a nice enough love song, but it doesn't really leave me with much to say. Still, overall, this is a really solid introduction to the band for me, and I think this shows a lot of potential for them and what they could do in the future, so I'm going to be giving this a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I want to talk about Avenged Sevenfold's newest, Life is But a Dream, and man, talk about a controversial album, that's for sure. This album got pretty much all sorts of crazy reactions to it, with some people calling it one of the worst rock/metal albums they've ever heard, while other people say that it is a very nice and even masterful change of pace from Avenged Sevenfold, who haven't been taking risks for quite some time. As for me, well, sort of similarly to the Sleep Token album I talked about a little bit earlier this past month, I do generally think that this album is good, but it's not the great masterpiece that some are building it up to be, nor is it the horrible downgrade that a lot of other people are saying that it is. I think it is somewhere in the middle, although I do lean more positively on this album, which was a little surprising to me because there are some weird things this album does, that's for sure. First of all, I will say that the first half of this album does fare quite a bit better than the second half. In fact, I would say the first 5 songs on this album are all pretty good to varying degrees. Game Over definitely will remind people of System of a Down, but it's an interesting change of pace for Avenged Sevenfold, and I think it establishes the theme of this album, of this idea of someone looking at the world and seeing what technology has done to it, and how we are slowly devolving as humans and are losing what originally made us human. I think Mattel is even a better example of this techno-dystopian future, and also describes the way we are so materialistic in our world and how we care more about what we have than about communicating with each other. Sure, it is sort of a cliche thing to say, and many people have said it in the past, but I think the way Avenged Sevenfold presents it here is fairly interesting. Nobody is a song that, I will admit, originally annoyed me a little bit the first time I heard it with its repetitive guitar work, but the more I listened to it, the more I appreciated it. It gives you time to listen to its lyrics, which have a very eerie feeling to it, of like an AI not really understanding how the world works, in the world from the perspective of this artificial intelligence being's eyes. It's super interesting, and I think a cool concept that ends up panning out pretty well for Avenged Sevenfold in this track. We Love You is definitely my favorite on the album. The first time I heard this song, I was pretty impressed with it and how ambitious it was. This one is weird, make no mistake about it. There are some odd things it does, from the beginning part where M. Shadows is using a weird effect on his voice that almost sounds sort of comical in a way, but also sort of eerie. And then going into this almost pop metal flair with just saying more of this thing and the desire to want more of stuff. But the more becomes eerie later on as you see this person losing their individuality, and you just realize that instead of wanting things that they care about, they're only wanting things that the government wants. Cosmic is also rather excellent and definitely an ambitious move for Avenged Sevenfold. Has a very ballad-like feel to it, but also incorporates some classic rock elements into it that I think a lot of people are going to like. Now, I will say what sort of kills this album in a big way, and I wish I liked it more than I did, but what kills this album in a big way is after track 5, it falls off pretty hard. I think Beautiful Morning, I get what it's going for, but it just doesn't work for me and gets pretty boring later on. Easier has some awful, awful production. I don't know how you can get past that, and Easier is probably the worst song on here in terms of that, because it just doesn't sound great. I have to unfortunately say that Beautiful Morning's production isn't that great either, but Easier, it's just a rough one to get through. And then the God trilogy, G, Ordinary, and Death, they all try to do varying things and vary up genres in big ways. G is super bizarre in particular, and it's in the perspective of God and views him as a megalomaniac villain, basically. And while it's an interesting idea, it doesn't go as theatrical as I think it should. Ordinary has a very Daft Punk feel to the point of near plagiarism, and it is sort of bothersome in that way. I wish that Avenged Sevenfold had put their own spin on the sound, but they really don't. And Death is trying to do this Frank Sinatra thing, but unfortunately, I don't think M. Shadow's vocals really work in terms of delivering the emotion that the song needs in order for that to really pan out in an effective way. Overall, though, I do think this Avenged Sevenfold album is an ambitious one, and I appreciate what it's going for. Sometimes its ambitions pay off in dividends, like on Mattel or We Love You. but other times it does not pay off at all on songs like Beautiful Morning or Easier. So I do still lean positively towards this album overall, and I'm going to give it a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about an album that I really don't have much to say about, which is Niall Horan's album, The Show. Now, I actually found myself surprised by really liking his last album. It definitely has a feeling of 90s rock to it in many places. On this new album, The Show by Niall Horan, who I actually would probably say has been the most consistently interesting out of the One Direction members now. I can't believe I am saying that now, but Harry Styles proved to be rather disappointing in recent years. At least Niall Horan is doing something more interesting. And while I am going to be ending up giving this album the same rating that I gave Harry Styles' album last year, I do generally feel more positive towards this one and could see myself coming back to more tracks on this one than that Harry Styles album from last year. Now, I will say that this album is trying to go for a bigger feel, and I'll give it credit for that, for feeling like the most expansive of Niall's albums in terms of the sound that it's going for, but I don't think it's as interesting as it could be. There are some on here that just feel like they are simply meant for feeling big on the radio. Heaven is an example of this, and while I do like Heaven and would say it's one of my favorites, it is sort of an indicator of what the rest of the album is going to feel like, where it's just more trying to go for this generic pop feeling, pop rock feeling, and not have as much of the personal meat to dig into as Heartbreak Weather did. I really like Meltdown as well. I think this one is pretty fun and has a nice rocking feel to it. And Save My Life has a very sweet message to it that I think shows Niall's sincerity once again, and I wish we had more songs like this one on the album. There are just a lot of songs on here that leave me with not much to say. For an example, If You Leave Me just sort of comes and goes without leaving an impact. I think that On a Night Like Tonight tries to do some interesting stuff but doesn't work, and Must Be Love is just sort of a boring song where I end up shrugging along with Science. As much as I wish I liked more of this album, it ultimately comes out a little bit above average for me. I wish there was more to dig into, but there really just isn't, and I was just left wanting more at the end of the day. 3 out of 5 stars for this one. Next, let's talk about the new Jessie Ware album, That Feels Good. Now, her album from a couple years ago got huge critical acclaim, and I'll be honest, I didn't check that one out, but now I really wish that I had of, because, man, this new album is pure 80s pop perfection in many ways. It is so great, and honestly might even be better than the Dua Lipa Future Nostalgia 80s album that I talked about back in 2020. And that's saying something, because I really liked that album as in terms of pop releases. This one feels, yeah, like I said, dignified. It just feels a lot more like it's going for maybe a more serious pop feel in some ways, but that doesn't mean that the album can't have fun. And it definitely does on a song like Free Yourself, for an example, which just feels positively euphoric, and I think the message is very positive and very relevant for right now, and definitely something that is very necessary. The title track is great too, and gets the energy and the ball rolling pretty fast. And then there's Begin Again, which just feels larger than life in many ways, with some of the most absolutely beautiful orchestral elements that I've heard in a pop album in quite some time. And I think its messages work overall very well. I think it is just trying to be positive and bigger than life in many ways, and I think it for the most part, meets those expectations. There are a couple songs that might go on a little bit too long, like maybe These Lips as the closing track isn't as intriguing as it could be, and maybe Hello Love, for an example, does overstay its welcome a little bit, but even at that, I don't mind the songs going too long. I think overall it works more often than not, and I think Jessie Ware is a very talented vocalist and lyricist, talented enough for it to work very often on this album, and for it to feel like just a great all-around release that I really enjoy listening to. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for this one. This is definitely one of my favorite albums of the year so far. Next, let's talk about Ed Sheeran's newest album, Subtract. Many are theorizing that this is the last album that he could have on a record label and that he might go more independent on his next release. And that might be a good theory, because this album is his most indie feeling in quite some time. It's feeling like it's not necessarily going for the big radio swings or going for those big singles like in the past. Now, Ed Sheeran is an artist who I feel like is way overhated. I will admit that his album Divide has shrunk on me over time and definitely has some of the more overhyped songs of the past decade in Shape of You, for an example, and Perfect, both of which are songs that do annoy me to no end. But overall, I don't find Ed Sheeran himself to be a very annoying artist. I think Subtract might even prove some people wrong that say that he's just going for the big sellout moments, because this album, it is not the case at all in my opinion. I think a lot of songs on here are very just laid back or drawn back and restrained, and more often than not on this album, that effect really works, and it does create an album that has a very indie feel, a surprisingly indie feel from one of the most mainstream artists out there. But when you think about it, it sort of makes sense for Ed Sheeran and his personality. Boat and Saltwater are great examples of this, with Saltwater in particular being a pretty harrowing track that has some very haunting moments in it and just a beautiful chorus that really blows me away. This might mark as one of my favorite Ed Sheeran songs that he has ever written. It is just excellent in what it does. I also really like Vega and the interesting lyrical ideas it explores. And End of Youth is sort of a tragic song where it's sort of reflecting on the idea of there was a time in Ed Sheeran's life where he saw the end of his innocence, and he's questioning if he could ever get that sense of youthful optimism back. And then The Hills of Aberfeldy brings his Irish roots in a way that is just beautiful. I love when he lets his accents through in his songs because they create some of his best songs, and I think this is another example of that, and ends the album off on a very strong note with one of the most fun songs on here, and one that leaves you feeling contemplative at the same time. Now, maybe this album goes on a little bit too long at 48 minutes and 14 tracks, but I generally think out of the Ed Sheeran albums that I've listened to, that this one, it makes sense for it to be more contemplative feeling and more lengthy, because it's clear that Ed Sheeran is going through a lot here personally, and he wants to express that. And for that reason, I really liked this album and was pleasantly surprised by it. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, let's end off by talking about the newest album from metal band Disciple, entitled Skeleton Psalms. Now, this album came out way back in April, so it is a bit of an earlier album that I'm talking about here, but at the same time, Disciple is my favorite band, if you did not know that, so I did want to talk about this album. Now, Disciple is my favorite band for a good reason. I generally think that they don't really have any bad albums to their name. Their worst albums are ones that I would consider mediocre, but once again, not bad at all. And they have my favorite album of all time in Horseshoes and Hand Grenades, as well as another one of my favorites in Scars Remain, so they're a very influential band to me. Now, I will say that this new album, Skeleton Psalms, while I did really like it at first, it did shrink on me a little bit with repeated listens. Now, does that mean this album is bad? No, far from it. I still think it's a good Disciple album. The one thing that leaves me a little disappointed about it is that on their last album, Love Letter Kill Shot, they were taking some of the biggest risks they've taken as a band in their new state. And that's something I've appreciated about Disciple, is that they've never really stayed in one corner for their career. I would say that Skeleton Psalms is probably the first example in a while that I've seen of Disciples staying in their comfort zone. Now, is it a bad comfort zone? No, not at all. I think it's a pretty good one, but this album feels probably the most reminiscent of Scars Remain of any Disciple album I've heard in quite some time. And for that reason, this album can pale a little bit in comparison, because for one, I do think the production value on Scars Remain is much higher than this album. Their independent albums, probably the worst thing about them has always been that their production hasn't been as strong as their albums where they were on a record label. But even with the weaker production on this album, which like I said has been a case for a lot of their independent albums, I still generally think that this album does still hit in many ways, just not as hard as I would want it to. The Executioner might be one of Disciple's modern best. I really like, once again, that it shows that they are just going to continue to have the Christian-centric messages. They're one of the few Christian rock bands who can actually have the Christian-centric message and not have it feeling cheesy or overblown, but instead feeling very sincere because of how they deliver it. Promise to Live is a beautiful sort of combination of rocker and ballad, which is something that Disciple always does so well. It reminds me a lot of Dear X, which is my favorite Disciple song, as well as my favorite song of all time. So of course I'm going to be a little biased to this one. Bad Words might be a little bit cheesy, but I can't deny that I have a fun time with it, even if the production on it makes the guitar riffs not hit as hard as I really think they could. If this one had the production of songs on Horseshoes and Hand Grenades or Scars Remain, it could be one of Disciple's best ever songs, but unfortunately in the state it's in, it's not quite that. But it is still a lot of fun, and I do still generally enjoy the message of it. And I think Bow Down is also a pretty fun track. It has a sort of dystopian feeling to it, which is pretty unique for Disciple, and I think it works for what they're going for. As far as weak moments on this album go, I will say the middle half of this album just doesn't hit as much as I would want it to. For an example, Resurrecting Reasons is just sort of a ballad that comes and goes without leaving much impact, and I feel like Dawning of Deliverance and 2020 Blind just both feel way too similar to each other for me to really care too much about them. And for the life of me, as much as I appreciate the sincerity in it, it's not a super interesting ballad that leaves me with much to say. But still, overall, I did really enjoy this Disciple album, and it once again does show why they are my favorite band. I still think that they have plenty of great material in them, and for as long as they're willing to deliver albums, I am always willing to listen to them. Kevin Young is such a talented vocalist and lyricist, and I appreciate that he continues to just make really good material. So I'm going to be giving this a strong 3.5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that was this episode of Quick Album Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the albums I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you like this video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.